This forbidden dual-screened handheld PC is probably one of the last things the Mario people want floating around in the wild, right behind Pal World and Gary Bowser. For reasons I don't think I need to elaborate on, I'm gonna be speaking a little vaguely about some of the games we test out on the Ayaneo Flip 1S DS. But just know, the thing you're thinking it'd be really good at is really good at. Hey, what's up? I'm Kyler. I'm gonna be taking care of things over here in the US on UFD Tech. Well, Brett's gone. Anyways, this little flippy doodad right here is what I like to call the Blintendo BS. We actually named the device that in the initial setup. It's one of a continuously growing line of Windows gaming handheld PCs, but this time with two displays in slightly different sizes and aspect ratios that are definitely not meant to be reminiscent of a certain other handheld from the mid to late 2000s. Other portable systems have done stuff similar to this in the past, like the GDP Win Mini, Retroid Pocket Flips, and even Ayaneo themselves with their previous generation Flip DS and KB model PCs. But this time around, there's a whole bunch of upgrades, most notably having to do with the bottom display and the newfangled Zen 5 APU power and the whole shebang. We got this one in the Retro Power colorway, which looks a little more like a rose gold iPhone if you ask me, but it's packed tight with an AMD Ryzen AI9 HX370 processor with integrated Radeon 890M graphics, 64 gigs of RAM, and a terabyte SSD for good measure. In terms of overall build quality and feel, Ayaneo really crushes it here, and that's not a surprise, because their products are always really beautifully constructed. The real deciding factor is going to be the software and how it realistically handles daily use. I will say having the top screen want to lock at a full 180-degree angle seems like a weird decision. 150 to 160-degree resting point probably would have been a lot more comfortable to hold, but the hinge is strong enough to change the angle to whatever you're chill with, so it's not really that big of a deal. Air intake holes on the back keep your fingers from getting hot during higher intensity gaming sessions, and don't take that for granted because the fans on this baby absolutely rip. And if you're pushing 30 watts, you will both hear and feel power, because hot air is going to be blowing out the top of this thing more than a circus clown on Balloon Animal Day, let me tell you what. The upper screen is a 7-inch 1080p OLED capable of 144 Hz, and the lower is a 4.5-inch 3:2 aspect ratio LCD at 1620 by 1080. Both are touchscreens and both are seemingly slightly improperly calibrated out of the box, so it was a little hard to type and get Windows set up initially, but we pushed through. You've got all the normal face buttons, a D-pad, start select, bumpers, triggers, and a couple recessed thumbsticks that'll allow you to actually close the clamshell design. Other than that, there's a handful of extra buttons meant to control either the bottom screen specifically, the Ayaneo ISpace software, volume, and power. Oh, and there's also this cool little optical sensor mouse that you can use as a mini trackpad and left click. It actually comes in big handy and is kind of like a less good version of what the Steam Deck's touchpads are. And of course, you can also expand the device's storage with a micro SD card. Now, before getting into how this thing can perform at gaming, I want to clear the air a little and talk about the stuff that wasn't too great about the Flip 1S DS experience. For starters, ISpace is quirked up, to say at the very least. We've tried many in Ayaneo over here, and the biggest issue almost always comes not from the device's performative capabilities, but the awkward tug of war that ISpace does with Windows 11. If you're at all familiar with handheld PCs, you'll know that it's pretty common practice to have a software that exists on top of Windows that sort of slides out from the side of the screen and says, hey, and lets you adjust things like power profiles and other device settings. In ISpace's case, sometimes it gets in the way of whatever game you're trying to play, especially when you're switching between different resolutions. Usually it's more of a temporary inconvenience than anything, but if you're using this thing all the time, like as your main gaming console, it might just start to wear you down at some point. We noticed specifically with CD Projekt Red's launchers for Cyberpunk and The Witcher 3, either the ISpace software or the existence of the second screen in general was sort of bending reality for the pop-up screen and stretching out the perspective, for lack of better words. And it became so much of a problem that it was happening more times than not. Next, like I mentioned before, the touchscreens always kind of felt like they weren't properly calibrated out of the box, which made it difficult to do things like type in passwords without a dedicated mouse and keyboard, and it seemed like the actual tracking points for your fingertip was always slightly below what you were actually aiming for. You can also use the bottom screen as a pseudo trackpad, which seems like a really good idea, but it immediately starts violently shaking the cursor around when you do that. So it's not really worth the trouble unless they patch that out in the future at some point. Ergonomics are overall not terrible or anything, but it could have used a little more weight in the corners where your palms are. The thing does come with like little swappable grippies that you can put on here, but it only comes with one other pair, and I'm not sure how well supported these things are gonna be in the future. And even all that wouldn't be too much of an issue if the right side thumbstick was up higher and in line with the left one. In this configuration, a person with reasonably sized adult hands will have to pull their right thumb super close to the rest of their hand or hold the entire console at an angle to comfortably have full range of motion. And don't get me wrong though, there's plenty to like about the Flip 1S too. And one of those things is definitely the Smart TDP Power Delivery Mode. By default, there's a slider on the bottom display that lets you choose what wattage you want to run your device at. But the built-in Smart TDP will dynamically change the output depending on the intensity of the task at hand. It'll save battery while you're not actively gaming, while also taking the guesswork out of what the best number to set everything at is. Especially since you can adjust the FPS limiter here too. Although I sincerely wish that the software didn't constantly try to reset it to 30. If you want to game at a higher frame rate than 30 while also fine-tuning your display settings, this thing loves resetting that thing back to the big 3-0, so you gotta keep an eye on it. The optical finger mouse is actually way more useful and responsive than you'd expect. And while it's been implemented on Ayaneo's other devices in the past, the texture and surface shape it has this time around separates it a bit from the pack. The only issues are the inability to right-click, which gets a little annoying, and you can't simultaneously click and drag, something that's really helpful on a handheld. The bottom screen can really come in handy if you're monitoring your system resources, since it's almost like an alternate, more gamer-focused task manager pop-up. You can see temperatures, usage percentages, TDP, FPS, and more all combined in an easily accessible screen that you can quickly switch off of in favor of using as a separate monitor instead. This is a little one, but the placement of the volume rocker is actually super convenient, although you could also potentially argue that it was a weird decision not to put the select and start buttons in its place at the bottom center of the device too, so it's more of a personal preference thing. I just like it. And finally, the OLED display on the top screen is absolutely beautiful, if nothing else. It'll make your retro games pop in a way you've probably never experienced them before. Plus, since a lot of these older games run in a different aspect ratio, the bezels are gonna stay perfectly unlit whenever they're running in full screen mode. But again, that's not the only thing the Flip 1S DS is good for. After all, this is an incredibly small form factor to have an 890M squeezed up into. So we gotta put it to the test with a couple games that seem relatively reasonable to try and boot up on a nearly $1,600 US handheld. Yeesh. Benchmarks. The idea of a flippy PC this small that can outperform a Z1 Extreme ROG Allies got me all hot and bothered. So we tried a couple games that seemed reasonably modern and did so with the Smart TDP power profile with the device unplugged from a power source for true untethered handheld gaming simulation. Although there is also a pass-through power mode that lets you power the Flip 1S straight from a wall socket without charging the thing, which could slightly improve your experience while also putting out less long-term stress on the battery. Far Cry 6 at 1080p and low graphics ran at an average of 55 frames in the benchmark and peaked at 66, and dropping the resolution to 720 medium got us above that 60 frames mark to a 62 average with a high of 74. We did also push it to 720p ultra and got a similar average to 1080 low. Cyberpunk could run at 1080 low with an average of 40 frames with a high of 66, with 720 high being nearly exactly the same performance-wise. But if you want to target 60 FPS, we found that 720 low averaged just shy of that, peaking at 80. Testing The Witcher 3 made us aware of a bizarre issue with the Project Red launcher that I mentioned earlier for this and Cyberpunk, where the whole window glitches out in a really weird way where it's almost like a perspective distortion, and it's being pulled from the top of the screen to the bottom. And again, at first we could kind of ignore it, but it got to the point where it was just happening all the time. Regardless, when it did load properly, The Witcher 3 at 1080 low chugged along at a 35 average while running around in White Orchard. And bumping it down to 720 low, we could squeeze out 48 with a high of 55. To throw a bit of a toughie at the Flip 1S, we busted out Expedition 33. And at 1080p low, it was just barely what one might consider to be playable at a 28 frame average that peaked at around 35. 720 low was a bit more forgiving though, and we were able to pull a 43 average that hit as high as just shy of 60. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is technically Steam Deck verified, so as ambitious as it is, we had mildly high hopes for this one. And it did run at 1080p low at above 30 frames and never dipped below 20, even during fights. But 720 low definitely felt like the way to go because it held pretty close to 60 consistently and never got lower than 30. Not exactly the best way to play this game, but it still works. Dying Light 2 at 1080 low hit an average of 32 frames that topped out at 67, and dialing it back to 720 low hovered at around 60-ish. To be really ambitious, we took a crack at the kinda new Oblivion remake at 1080p low, and it only averaged at like 25 frames and was pretty unstable to say the least. And try as we might force the game into 720p resolution, it just would not let us do it on the Flip 1S. The option didn't exist in the game settings, even though it should be there. We tried setting the display itself to 720 and it threw an error message when launching the game. And changing the .ini file did absolutely nothing either. We were able to run old school Oblivion at 1080 Ultra no sweat though. It cranked out an average of 83 frames that never dipped below 47 and would occasionally cross the 100 FPS threshold. Go figure though, an old game runs good. And just because I know this is gonna get played a ton on this thing, Balatro, don't worry guys, at 1080p runs at 254 FPS, which, hold on a second, that performance headroom will actually maybe be important to you when you realize that you can actively watch YouTube videos on the second screen while also not finishing your runs for hours at a time. Speaking of time, we also ran a battery drain test running Far Cry 6 at 720 low on the Smart TDP profile with an uncapped frame rate, and this little thing, the trooper that it is, squeaked out a full 37 minutes of playtime from a full charge. Give it up, everybody. Woo! Granted, you could definitely increase that by lowering the output wattage, but you'll take a pretty hefty performance hit too. Bottom screen. Speaking of that second bottom screen, what's it actually doing down there? Well, if you were thinking it'd be just like another monitor, it kind of is, but it's trying to be more than that too. Immediately upon loading into Windows for the first time, you're greeted with a whole user interface being displayed down there separately from the Microsoft UI. You can toggle between a sort of quick access toolkit here and hiding it to purely use the second screen as a complementary monitor. Complimentary. But there's also a handy option in the baked-in UI that lets you use the touch interface to pull a single screen at a time from the top display to the bottom, which would otherwise be really inconvenient without a traditional mouse and keyboard. Remember, you can't drag things with the little touchy boy. The bottom GUI is structured into 5 main modes that you can switch from. There's Monitor, which shows you a bunch of hardware info for your device. Performance, which is kind of similar to the ISpace UI feature set-wise, and lets you adjust stuff like your power profile and FPS limiter. The Quick Assistant tab has a handful of ease of access buttons and keyboard keys that'd otherwise be awkward to input with just a controller and touchscreen. Application lets you add a sort of hotbar for quick access to different apps. And Smart Dual Screen, which lets you pull a single window down to the bottom screen. And that one's important for doing the stuff that the Red Luigi people aren't too fond of. Dual screen gaming. And that brings me to probably why most of you've clicked on this video, the convenience of playing nondescript dual screen games. The Ayaneo Flip 1S DS doesn't come stock loaded with illicit software or anything, so if one were interested in using it for such a thing, they'd need to figure that part out for themselves, and the act of actually making use of the second screen for dual screen gaming isn't super obvious unless you're already at least mildly familiar with the process, which I'm sure plenty of you probably are. You essentially need to open your dual screen gaming software and make sure you're running said game in 2 independent windows, which is typically an option with these things. Allegedly. One of these fellas will go on the top screen and the other on the bottom, and the smart dual screen function can be used to pull the bottom dual screen gaming window to the bottom display before switching to full screen mode. Then kerblammy, you got Eminem's kart racing on demand, and it runs legitimately well, or at least as well as Eminem's kart racing can run to begin with. And to be honest, I kinda hope it did, since it was a low-end handheld game released just a year after the original Oblivion. We also tested out the very safe and not first-party Pets Life Hamsters 2, which is a game intended to have children collect and care for virtual rodents, and definitely not a game that rhymes with Blintendogs. And again, as far as performance, no complaints. And while we were at it, we broke out the 3D dual screen version of Metal Gear Solid 3, not to be confused with Metal Gear Solid Delta. Although it probably performs even worse than that game would on this thing, so it was kind of a wash. We're sure some simpler 3D games could run on this thing, but we don't want to risk saying too much here. Just know that if you really must have something to run retro, dual screen games, price aside, this is probably the best device to do it, at least for now. Okay, all in all, I want to like the Flip 1S, but the Ayaneo tax is real, and 1,600 bonerinos is the equivalent of MSRP for a 4090, and this is a difficult flippy pill to swallow. I'm left wondering, who exactly is this thing for? Because it functions performance-wise with modern games like an entry-level gaming PC, but it's also comically far beyond most people's price range, especially those who'd consider a low-end machine. Sure, it is technically better than a ROG Ally, but is it worth the potential extra $1,000 US? I feel like the pricing for handhelds still hasn't yet become competitive enough for me to look past the affordability of a Steam Deck. And I'm not sold enough on the idea of playing higher resource demanding games on the go enough for the exorbitant cost of this thing. Again though, it does do the dual screen gaming stuff, probably as well as a device could just because of the second screen. But I can't shake the thought that they could get away with a much lower end APU to cut the price down. Especially since you could literally buy a handheld that the Flip 1S is allegedly aspiring to kind of look like for a fraction of the cost, along with a couple games, and that's likely all you'd be using it for anyways. Tell your dad I said hi.